This video is for people who are trying to decide what would be best for them in terms of graduate school. Do you go into the PhD? Do you go into the PsyD? Does it really matter which one you choose, or are they basically essentially the same thing? One of the ways that we can break this down is looking at each one individually, and then we can compare the two towards the end. What is going on, everybody? Welcome back. My name is Phil Sarpon. This is Phil's Guide to PsyD. This channel is dedicated to all things psychology, wellness, and graduate school. Today, I wanted to do a video on some of the differences between a clinical psychology PhD program and a clinical psychology PsyD program. Now, let's start with the clinical psychology PhD program. What is the PhD in clinical psychology? Well, it is a doctoral program in clinical psychology that deals mainly with research, but PhDs have historically been a little bit more focused on research, and that was actually part of the reason why the PsyD was built from the PhD, because they realized essentially that it was really important for PsyDs or for clinical psychologists to be as focused in clinical as well as research. Now, many programs have sort of evolved over time, and I will say that clinical psychology PhD and PsyD programs at this point in time look very similar, especially if they are APA accredited. APA is the accreditation that gives programs the necessary guidelines that they need to fulfill in order to be APA accredited and in order to make sure that they're doing the responsible diligence of producing really good clinical psychologists. And one of the things that they recommend, or that they actually standardize for most APA accredited programs, is that every program has to make sure that they fulfill a certain number or level of coursework and courses that are pertaining to the specific components of becoming a clinical psychologist. This means that every program has to have a certain number of research courses, bio courses, stats courses. And so what you'll find is that if there's a program that's APA accredited, regardless of if they have a PhD or a PsyD, their courses are going to look really similar because they're APA standardized by this accreditation. So then the question becomes, well, then if I go to a PhD or I go to a PsyD and it doesn't really matter, I'm going to end up taking essentially the same courses, then why does it really matter if I choose between a PhD or a PsyD? And typically for most people, they will respond with that question with saying that typically PhDs are fully funded. Now, again, this isn't always the case. And I've actually had students come up to me and say, wow, I thought this PhD program was fully funded, and I realized that it actually wasn't funded. Or by my second or third year, the funding got taken away. Or it's funded, I have to work 20 to 25 hours in research assisting and teaching assistant to get the stipend that I was promised every year, right? So there are probably going to be stipulations in regards to whether PhD programs are funded or not. And you really have to do your due diligence and ask those direct questions on where the funding is coming from, how consistent the funding is. Again, I've had situations where students have gone into a PhD program and their research lab director lost funding for some of their research projects. And so now that student has to kind of fumble and figure out what they're going to do for the research or dissertation project, because now it's not funded and that specific lab has lost funding. And so I would not put all of my eggs in one basket and completely pick a PhD program just because it's funded, because it doesn't necessarily mean that that funding is going to be permanent while you are in graduate school. So that's definitely something that you have to weigh the pros and cons in regards to choosing a clinical psychology PhD program. The other thing about clinical psychology PhD programs is that sometimes they do have a longer length of programs. Typically, PsyD programs are 4 years. PhD programs could be 5 or 6 years potentially, because they do require a little bit more research heavy focused courses and experiences from their students. And so this again is something to consider. Now, there are plenty of PhD programs that are only 4 years, and then you have the 1 year of an internship. But again, all of these programs kind of look a little bit different, which is why it's so confusing, which is why I always recommend people to go into clinical psychology programs that are APA accredited, because that's going to be the best standardized way that you can make sure that there's a certain quality in all of the programs that you're choosing from. The third biggest difference with clinical psychology PhD programs is that they are typically well respected. Now, there has been a lot less stigma of the PsyD programs because at one point in time, it was considered that the PsyD programs just were not as good as the PhD programs. This myth is pretty much been dispelled. If we were to look in general at a lot of different PsyD programs, sometimes they even have funding. Sometimes they actually put more emphasis into research. There are amazing psychologists that will come out of PsyD programs. So it's really not to say who's a better therapist, a PsyD or a PhD. They get essentially the same training, and they still have to also take the same licensure exam. So it's not like the PhD are taking a different licensure exam than the PsyD. But what I will say about the PhD is that there are certain institutions that typically favor or prefer PhD applicants. For example, certain internship sites, they wouldn't maybe necessarily say this explicitly, but most of their intern class, their residency class, was mostly people from PhD programs. And in fact, there were some programs that would explicitly say, hey, if you're a PsyD, don't apply here because we only take PhDs. Again, most places don't do this still, but there are still some places that still do. So if you were to go into a clinical psychology PhD program, you might have a little bit of a slight advantage in terms of getting clinical rotations, getting into an internship, getting into a postdoc. Typically, by the time you actually are licensed as a psychologist, it really doesn't matter. Most places are only going to focus on what your experiences are rather than if you're a PhD or a PsyD. And typically when it does come to pay, it's going to be the same process. They're not going to pay a PhD more than a PsyD. They're going to pay a psychologist what they're owed in terms of what the worth is that psychologist is going to be able to do for that institution. But honestly, I don't know if it's necessarily going to mean that much for you, especially if you're 10 years, 15 years, 20 years into your career. Already mentioned it, but typically PsyD programs are 4 years, and then you have that 1 year of an internship, and then you become a clinical psychologist once you're licensed. The thing about PsyD programs, as I mentioned with the PhD might focus a little bit more on research, the PsyD might focus a little bit more on clinical work. But again, there are PsyD programs that heavily focus on research work, heavily focus on clinical work, and more programs are emphasizing both the clinical and the research. And especially if they're already standardized by the same accreditation, then they're going to automatically have the same requirements as the other. All right. So this is something to consider as well when you're choosing PsyD programs. If you want to work in a private practice, again, it's probably not going to matter if you're a PhD or a PsyD. If you're wanting to have an internship or residency in a really reputable, acclaimed academic university that typically generally only takes PhD students, then it might work to your favor and to your benefit to pursue the PhD, right? If that's not something that is of that much interest to you, then it may not matter as much. And so people are going to have to figure out what are going to be the most important things for you in regards to choosing between the PhD or the PsyD. Now that I've broken out the differences between the two, I've also mentioned the many similarities of the two. When I did my clinical and practicum rotations, I was with other PhD students. When I was in my internship, I was with other PhD students. When I'm going to get my licensure and I start working, I will be with other PhD graduates. If you have an end goal of where you want to end up in regards to research or clinical experience, and you can work your way backwards in terms of what is actually important for you, I think that's going to be the best thing to help you choose and make the right decision. At the end of the day, this is the best advice that I can give, is finding a school that you like, that is a good fit for you. Regardless of it being a PhD or a PsyD, do you like the research work that they're doing? Do you like the clinical opportunities that they have? Do you like the patient population that you can work with? Do you like the faculty staff? Do you like the people in the program and in the intern cohort? Do you like the city in which the program is in? Do you like where you're going to be if you go into the program and you start to become a clinical psychologist? If you feel like this program is a really good fit for you in terms of your personality and your strengths and the things that you care about or the things that you're passionate about, does it really matter if it's a PhD or a PsyD? But I think what's ultimately going to be really important is that if you can get to your end goal and be matched to a really good school, that's not just a win for you, that is a win for the program, and that is a win for your educational journey and being able to look back and know that you made the right decision for yourself. Now, if you're still trying to figure out what to do in terms of the clinical PhD or the PsyD, I encourage you to reach out to me. You can follow me on all of my socials at Phil's Guide to PsyD, where I give more tips, guidance, and tricks on how to be successful in your early career. If you have not already, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.